Without subjects, objects have no value.
I have to agree with theoretical bullshit here that, without subjectivity, objectivity has no value because there has to be a difference between the two. There is a value to what is objective or factual because of the fact that there are things that are just opinion, or are not factual.
And then you conclude that all value is subjective, like this.
You already made the point that value is subjective because you were trying to make the point that Hitler wasn't necessarily going against the idea that killing people, even though you said for entertainment, was a bad thing because they believed that what they were doing was right. So you kind of already made that point.
Means value is necessarily subjective.
It is subjective.
Always.
You already made that point.
What you're doing is making a circular argument.
No, you're contradicting yourself.
My thoughts immediately go back to your first video. I'll play a little clip from it. Just replace the words right and moral with the term value.
So if you really want to degenerate into fighting over verbal real estate, if you really want to stick a flag in words like right and moral and insist that they be defined the way you want to define them, then that's cool. Obviously, I'm not talking about that then. You can have the word right. It's okay, it's just a word. I'll find some other arbitrary combination of vowels and consonants, and when you're ready to grow up and discuss things that actually matter, I'll be right here.
Alright, next you talk about biblical morality.
You kind of just glazed over that last part, but this part, I think, is where he talks about a story in the Bible, and, I have to agree, you're really mincing words. You're really almost like grabbing at straws to try to make these points. I mean, this is pretty straightforward to me, and for somebody who has morals, especially hardwired morals, that, you didn't even need God for, or maybe you do think that, I don't know, I'm confused with that whole area because you keep kind of going back and forth. But, I can't believe that somebody would read like a story like this. This is a good example of why, after a lot of people read the Bible, they end up becoming atheists.
Take 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 23 to 24. Elisha is traveling to Bethel when some youngsters show up and poke fun at his bald head. Now, Elisha asks God to do something about this, and so God sends 2 woodland bears to maul and kill 42 of this town's children. And that's the whole story. Elisha continues on his way. After that, it's never mentioned again.
Let's add a bit more information that you may have overlooked. The word you translate as children comes from this Hebrew word, and it refers to individuals between the age of 12 and 30.
Okay, I gotta stop you right there. So if there are people between the age of 12 and 30, that makes it better or okay? How does that make a difference? So you're mincing words. And I would bet that if we looked that up, it does say children. But, you're going with whatever translation. Anyway, this is a good example of how you're more moral than God. And we'll talk about that.
Elisha is God's prophet.
Who cares if he's God's prophet? God is impartial, is he not? God doesn't treat anybody over anybody else. He's, equal opportunity smoter, right? That's what he says. So either he is or he is not. Either he's a liar or he isn't a liar. Just because somebody's his prophet doesn't mean he should treat them better or differently than anybody else.
Bethel is a town infamous for idolatry.
So what? He wasn't doing this because of idolatry. He was doing this because he was punishing them for making fun of his prophet.
The mob consists of over 42 young men, not merely some youngsters poking fun at him for his bald head. And it doesn't say maul and kill, it just says maul.
Isn't maul the same thing as kill? And, actually we could argue that if somebody were to be killed and we don't really know how they were killed, that we could at least say that maybe that was more humane than being mauled, because we know what mauled is.
Alright, back to you.
So let's talk about intention. Premise 1. Actions consistent with God's nature are moral, while actions inconsistent with God's nature are immoral. Premise 2. God's actions are always consistent with God's nature. Premise 3. From 1 and 2, God's actions are always moral. Premise 4. God performs the act of terminating the life of a child with the intention of punishing them for making fun of baldness. Conclusion, therefore, from 3 and 4, it is moral to terminate the life of a child with the intention of punishing them for making fun of baldness.
Now, what he did right there, isn't that what you were talking about as far as, what did you call that? Deductions or whatever kind of arguments? kind of arguments that you can't really argue against or whatever in your mind. That's exactly what he did there. So I don't know how you argue against it.
I disagree with your premise 4 here.
Oh,
God
okay.
performed the act of having an angry mob mauled by a bear for the intent of punishment, to protect his prophet.
To protect his prophet from what? The only thing we have from that story is that he was being teased for his baldness. So let me understand this. If you agree that God is where we get our morality from, or you agree with God's morality and therefore that's why you chose Christianity, let's say that. Or maybe you think that we were hardwired to have morality, like you've argued, and you think somehow that's from God, because God created us to be hardwired for morality, which I'm assuming that must be what you think, because you believe in God. You believe God is where we get our morals from. Anyway, so even if that's the case, this is a prophet, granted, but like I said, he treats everybody equally. He's impartial. He says he's an impartial God, so either he's a liar or he's not impartial. He's a liar if that's not true. So you can't make him not true. Well, you can, but then you need to ask what you're believing. But what was he protecting him from? What, from his ego getting hurt? I mean, people get teased all the time. You're going to tell me that it was necessary or it was moral in your right to punish a crime of teasing somebody by mauling them? In your mind, that was moral. You see, that's what you have to ask yourself. Are you more moral than this God that you're worshiping? And if you are, and you find that you wouldn't do the same things that this God would do, then why are you worshiping this God? And how can this be a God if your morals are better? If humanity's morals have surpassed that of said God, then the God's probably not true then, because his morals should be superior to ours.
Bring about some greater good, or all the above.
Greater good. So he did that to bring about some greater good. What, to teach us that, he's God, and if he decides that he wants to protect his prophet, that's what he's going to do, showing us that he's a liar? Well, I guess I call that greater good, because then maybe that means there'll be more atheists in the world.
Let's look at your next argument.
Now, as it happens, you do try to make the argument that a single act can be moral when performed by God and yet immoral when performed by humans.
I
And you
agree.
attempt to do this by drawing an analogy between God and a fair-minded judge.
You claim that an action can be immoral and consistent with God's nature. I'm going to oppose that idea. This is exactly why I gave the analogy of a human judge. Now, for those who don't remember, I had said that it's acceptable for a fair-minded judge to imprison people, but not acceptable for John Doe to lock up people he finds unjust in his basement.
Yeah, but the only difference between John Doe locking somebody up in his basement and the judge is that the judge was given the authority to, which I guess I can see where you're going with that, because you feel that because God is God, therefore he has the authority to make these judgments. Therefore, even if he appears to be more immoral than the creatures he created, or you yourself, it's okay because he's God. And that is really, that's not logical.
Now, the human judge and John Doe are not on a different standard of morality.
Okay, and that contradicts what you just said. If they're not on a different standard of morality, just like you and your God are not on a different standard of morality.
The only difference is circumstances.
Circumstances.
Think back to my
being what?
original definition of morality.
Okay.
The relevant portion here is how best to achieve your goals. With that in mind, the judge has more resources and the ability.
Okay, wait. How best to achieve your goals? So that goes back to my argument that morality is based on logic and learned through experience. How best to achieve your goals? Well, you think we were born knowing what the best way is to achieve our goals? No, we learn that. We create tools. We, see what happens when we do A, B, C, or D. We look at the results of things. We test things. We try things. We might fail a lot of times, but we learn what works and what doesn't. That's where morals come from.
Ability to achieve his goal. The judge can incarcerate a criminal and bring about the greatest good for the community and succeed in that goal. John Doe, on the other hand, does not have the ability to incarcerate the criminal and bring about the greatest good for the community.
Well, he does, technically. I mean, if you lock a guy in your basement who's like, say a murderer, like you're a vigilante kind of trying to, you're being like a Robin Hood. You're trying to handle the bad guys yourself. You could technically do that.
He doesn't have the resources and would fail in that goal.
Not necessarily. There's a lot of people with a lot of resources. You'd be surprised.
But we can prove these two are under the same moral code because if we can make them theoretically switch positions, making John Doe become the judge and the judge become John Doe.
Okay.
But morality wouldn't change.
Okay, so the morality wouldn't change. So you're both under the same morality, which means that, you know, your God should follow the same moral code that you do and vice versa, I suppose.
Whoever is in the position of the judge would be better able to judge fairly.
That's not true. There's been plenty of judges that have made judgments that, you know, the majority of the country has been in uproar about. You know, they do it for corrupt reasons, or they just don't make the best judgment sometimes, you know. That to say that just because somebody has the title of something means that they're the best person for that is really a naive thing to think.
Now, I really want to make this point clear, so let's use one more analogy.
Okay.
Let's say Jane Doe drinks a beer to refresh herself. No harm, no foul. And then 6 months sober, recovering alcoholic John Doe drinks a beer to refresh himself. Now, he might not be able to handle it, and his action will cause harm. The same moral principle applies to both John and Jane here. Don't become an alcoholic. It causes harm. The only difference is that Jane is in a position that her actions would not violate that principle.
Yeah, but that's not a position. Not have been an alcoholic for Jane, that's not a position. That's just naturally her propensity. She doesn't have the propensity to be an alcoholic or to become an alcoholic if she has a drink because she never was an alcoholic to begin with. So that's like saying, you know, her hair's blonde instead of brunette. It's not a position she was given. It's not a position she earned. Anyway.
John's actions would have. Another way of saying this would be, John and Jane are held to the same objective values, but due to John's circumstances, only John's behavior is inconsistent with those values.
I kind of understand what you're saying about this, but I still think that if you worship a God whose morals are not superior to your own, there's something fundamentally wrong with that.
Alright, next point. There was a short clip from my earlier video that seemed to cause some confusion, so sorry about that if I wasn't very clear the first time. Here's your original premise. And here's how I amended it.
Okay, is honesty right just because that's what God's nature essentially to be? Is honesty right? I can't even see this. Is honesty right just because that's what God's nature happens to be, was what I guess theoretical bullshit said. And then you amended it by saying, is honesty right just because that's what God's nature essentially is? I think.
Changed it is because God is by definition an uncreated being. So to talk about when an uncreated thing happened doesn't really make sense.
Is honesty right just because that's what God's nature happens to be? So I think what he's talking about is the only reason for somebody, is it only good to be honest because God's nature is honest? And you're talking about, I don't understand what you're talking about, how that relates.
Uncaused things by definition didn't happen. That which is uncreated yet exists never happened, rather it always was. I'll try and respond to the rest of your points in a later video. As all.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter if God's nature always was that way and he's an uncreated being. The point is that if you choose that worldview or you choose that God over other gods, you're saying that I believe in this God's morals over the other ones. I believe this God is worth worshiping over other gods. I believe this God to be true even though my morality and humanity's morality is superior to this God's. But I'm going to keep allowing this God to, you know, dictate those things, even though I can see logically, and if I were to be honest with myself, I can see that those things are wrong, and I would never do those things, but it doesn't matter because I'm not in the position of God, and he's God, and so that's okay. And that is kind of, I think, where, you know, a lot of people have a problem with that, because, you know, you seem like you're trying to go at this from a logical perspective. You're trying to look at all this stuff logically. You're trying to be logical about it, I guess I should say. But I don't know how honest you're being about it, because I think in order to try to make it logical or make your argument logical for what you believe and why you believe it and so on and so forth, you're actually having to twist or ignore a lot of what the doctrine says that goes along with the God that you're claiming to believe in. And, you know, that's not logical.
Always test everything, hold on to the good.
I agree with you on that. Thanks.